So this is really a special moment in time. Our office has heard time and time and time again that the system is too complex. This doesn't come from a unique perspective. This comes from all perspectives across the procurement environment. And I'm here today to say enough. Time to make those substantive changes is now. I give the example of a Canadian supplier who sells to a foreign government and not to the federal government of Canada because it is easier. That is a damning statement. It is important to understand that context. It is important to understand that other jurisdictions are doing procurement better than we are. That needs immediate change. That needs foundational changes. And so I'm pleased to be with you today to announce that we are publishing a report on solutions. Those solutions address the 5 foundational changes that are necessary in federal procurement. Why it's important coming from us. We offer an honest, independent viewpoint. We don't sit inside federal bureaucracy. We don't represent suppliers. We offer an independent viewpoint. While I do report to the minister, who ultimately tables our annual report to Parliament, we absolutely do all aspects of our work absolutely independently. So the first change I want to highlight is that of the creation of a Chief Procurement Officer. Now I understand that that may result in a bit of an eye roll because you think, hey, the answer to every government problem is not creating a new position or creating additional layers of bureaucracy. But one of the things we have noted is the lack of accountability in federal procurement. So ultimately, who will be accountable for ushering us through this important period of change? And that person has to be the Chief Procurement Officer. This position has to be created at the highest level of government, and it has to have the singular focus of federal procurement and improving the processes that currently exist. They need to be an agent of change. There is a cultural shift that's required in federal procurement. We have done the same things for far too long. Our office annually publishes a top 10 list of procurement issues that we see across a variety of stakeholders. Those stakeholders include suppliers, federal buyers, the general public, politicians. And there is a certain static, repetitive nature of those top 10 issues. And so at a certain point, we looked at ourselves and said, what are we doing as an office to make those improvements ourselves? And you might have heard me say that Band-Aid solutions are not enough. And many of the recommendations that we were making while addressing specific issues within the existing system were just that, Band-Aid solutions. And we can no longer sustain Band-Aid solutions. We have to address the foundational issue that our system is too complex and it's not working for all participants. The CPO will be charged with the responsibility of ushering us through that change. So the reason for the lack of accountability is the bifurcated nature of the federal procurement system. Having someone who sits atop the system with those responsibilities specifically identified is critical to the success, and that's why I talk about it first, because this position will ultimately be responsible for implementation of the subsequent issues that I'm going to be addressing. The second one is vendor performance management. So I apologize to those of you who have heard me speak in the past because this is something I've been speaking about for years. And I really hope the attention is now. Vendor performance management is something so basic that the average Canadian understands the concept. If you were to hire a plumber to fix a leak in your kitchen, and that plumber arrived 2 hours late and brought the wrong tools, what are the chances that that average Canadian is going to be using that plumber in a subsequent need? The answer is they're not, right? That's a simple decision that the Canadian taxpayer is able to make. Now, in the federal procurement context, the problem is even more acute than that. And I'll play it out in 2 scenarios. One, a supplier, poor performing, works for a specific department within the federal government. That performance is noted as poor. However, there's nowhere to go with that information. It doesn't give rise to a termination of the contract, but it's so bad that the services or the good that were provided were ultimately not for the intended purpose. That same supplier goes to a different department and is able to sell those same services and same good without any ramification of that poor performance with that first department. Right? So that's a pretty damning scenario. But a second scenario that I would highlight is within the same department, that same vendor continues to sell those services and the same good. Now, within that department, individuals speak to one another and highlight the fact that this is a known poor performer. So that group of people who are charged with the new acquisition process ask themselves, what can be done within the existing rules? Because ultimately people want to follow the rules, but more importantly, don't want to waste taxpayer funds. So they look at the rules that are available to them and realize there are no great rules that will allow them to do what they want to do. So they create restrictive criteria to ensure that the participation of that poor performer is not available. But as a byproduct of that decision, what ends up happening is additional measures to other viable Canadian suppliers. So those Canadian suppliers are not eligible to participate in that process, right? And that limits competition, and it has a dramatic impact. Another thing you've heard me talk about is documentation. If you haven't followed the rules, what do you think the chances are that you're going to document the fact that you haven't followed those rules? Again, chances are you're not going to document that decision. Therefore, documentation is again a byproduct of no VPM. So I implore everyone to highlight this need. This is a missing puzzle piece. Now I must say, PSPC is making progress in this regard. They have a pilot project that we are looking at very optimistically in hopes that it is the building block upon which it will grow into a government-wide solution. But having an initial level pilot project is not sufficient. And again, back to accountability. Who is accountable to ensure that this is stood up in a timely manner? So that's issue number 2. Number 3 is the rule set. So going back to my comment about complexity, the rules drive the complexity. Most jurisdictions have federal procurement either at the statutory or regulatory level. Every stakeholder we speak to in the procurement space, whether they be buyers or suppliers, struggle to understand the applicable rule set. And the reason is there's multiple sources for the rules, none of which is particularly authoritative. You have free trade agreements that apply in certain circumstances. You have a statute, the Financial Administration Act, that makes cursory mention to federal procurement, fair, open, and transparent. You have a regulation, the government contracting regulation, that says you must compete unless certain exceptions are met. But beyond that, no specific rules are provided. One level below, you have the Directive on the Management of Procurement, a principles-based directive, which requires the creation of a framework by departments. Those frameworks include underlying policies. Those underlying departmental specific policies include guidelines, instructions. So if you can see the broadening, the apex of the triangle, which is the statute, is very narrow and a very broad base, meaning what is ultimately authoritative is very thin. We're suggesting look at other jurisdictions who do this differently. They have a strong federal procurement system created by way of statute or regulation. There are multiple regulations, there are multiple jurisdictions cited in our report. I would encourage all of you to look at those jurisdictions because, like I mentioned, if Canadian suppliers are looking at other jurisdictions because it's easier, why as the federal government are we not also looking to those other jurisdictions to improve where we can? And again, I'm not suggesting that there's a magic answer. Right? There is no solution that's going to solve all procurement issues, but we need to work towards modernizing the system. Continually working within the existing framework is simply not working. And the last thing I'll say on this point is part of where our frustration came from was the acknowledgement that these issues have existed well beyond my tenure. I've been the Procurement Ombud for 7.5 years. My commitment was not at the last day, on my last day of my term, was I going to issue a scathing report saying how federal procurement was broken. If I wanted to do my job effectively and leave procurement in a better place, I had to stand up and speak the truth. And the truth is the system needs to be overhauled. And that's really the importance of today. The fourth change is AI. I'm not sure how much time I need to spend on AI, simply to say that if we're constructing a new design for a federal procurement process, we need to acknowledge that AI is already being used by suppliers. Suppliers are using AI to actually create bids. So if we're not incorporating AI as part of our methodology to help us become more efficient and effective in doing federal procurement, again, we risk being left behind. So it is absolutely essential. One thing that AI can help us do, and this will be particularly interesting for those in the room, is data. right? I'm sure many of you tried to report accurately on procurement issues. Some of you contact our office seeking to validate the information that you're seeing online, made transparent by the federal government, to validate whether it's accurate or not. And accuracy is critical in data. And so how can you effectively do your jobs as reporters and provide information to the Canadian public if you don't have accurate data? So our fifth foundational change is create a robust framework for data to ensure, specific to procurement, to ensure that it is searchable, accurate, and timely. And without those, even having an AI tool that searches the existing data set, while it does address one problem, which is the human hours necessary to search all of the various data sources to create a storyline that you believe is accurate, but ultimately are unsure. Right? And we've seen through our own reports that the accuracy of that data is questionable. Sometimes the applicable rules are wrong, sometimes the value of the contract is wrong, sometimes it's not made available at all, or it's not made available in a timely manner. So the fact that data needs to be presented in a different manner is absolutely necessary. Even with the incorporation of AI, that doesn't necessarily fix the problem associated with data. So where does that leave us? So both David and myself, the Deputy Procurement Ombud, have met with both ministers, Minister Lightbound and Minister Fuhrer, who have an issue with transformation on their laps. And they are both very keen to better understand our perspectives, and they were both willingly wanting to participate in an ongoing dialogue with our office to ensure that the transformational issues that we described in the report are well thought through, well addressed by whatever happens next. So I leave it there, and I encourage questions in terms of how we get to that next step. And the last thought I will simply say is that we have to seize the opportunity. So everyone now is talking about transformation. There's seemingly an acknowledgement that the system is not working effectively. If we do not act now, I fear that I could be before you in 2 years' time at the end of my mandate saying the same things. And to be honest, I can't. It's a failure of the system if that's the situation. So it's incumbent on everyone involved in federal procurement to take all of the issues we know to exist and start implementing solutions that will adequately address them. Thank you.
For now, we will start with Bill Curry with the Globe and Mail.
Good morning. Yesterday, the finance minister asked all ministers to try to find internal savings, and all political parties in the last election said that contracting, outsourcing is an area where there's money to be found there. This is your world. In your time reviewing the way Ottawa spends on contracts, is there a lot of wasteful spending? Is there a lot of savings to be found, or is this running well?
So I can only answer in the areas that we have done reviews, right? And we've certainly seen issues associated with service contracts. And so associated with those issues, there's cost savings to be had. There are changes that have been recently announced by the department that we're looking at optimistically. As I recently mentioned, for our purposes, it's too early to comment in terms of how effective those changes will be in reducing the amount of spending and waste. However, the hypothesis around whether in fact there is additional waste to be recaptured by having a more efficient and robust oversight system, we absolutely support that notion, particularly in contract administration, and that's something that we're looking to have a more strengthened lens to look at that issue specifically. And by that I mean, when the contract is awarded, there's a lot of transparency around it, and that's typically where the media attention goes. Contract administration is more of a confidential process where it's just between the parties to the contract, and there are things happening in contract administration that give us cause for concern, and we want to ensure that we do accrue those efficiencies that are negotiated and specifically contemplated in the award process, that they materialize in the contract administration phase.
And as my next question, you mentioned poor performers, and I'd like to get your sense as to how far that goes, because there is, as an example, there's a case where the federal government is pursuing one contractor and subcontractor where the billing was more than 24 hours a day. There's those kinds of allegations of outright fraud. In your view, is that kind of poor performance common?
So again, it's too early for me to answer a question about the quantum or how often this is happening, because again, what we note is there isn't a system to accurately capture that picture for you to directly answer your question. That being said, we know that there are poor performers who continue to get government contracts. We hear that information from government buyers. Government buyers are asking for a VPM system so that information can be shared openly and transparently. But without a process, how does one share that information about poor performance so it actually has an impact on future contracts that are awarded by the federal government? So to answer your question, what we hear is certainly, yes, there are poor performers in the system. There is a financial cost to that poor performance, and there aren't the tools available yet to address that poor performance.
Hey there, Laura Osman with The Logic. Are you advocating, when it comes to artificial intelligence, something that would be involved in the decision-making process? Because we know, of course, that procurement is also a subjective process.
Right.
And so what are your cautions and what are you advocating for?
Right. So at this point, I think it would be premature to actually allow decisions to be contemplated through AI tools. At this point, it's more the creation of the scope of work, the creation of the criteria, where you're taking an amalgamation of existing data and using best practices. And again, it should require oversight, right? At this point, I don't think the AI tool is to replace the human interaction in the procurement process, but it's to make it more efficient. So the time associated with the creation of a scope of work could go from several hours to several minutes, right? And so if you extrapolate those efficiencies across the system, those are significant savings. Now, those human elements can be used in higher level complexity work, but we're not there yet. But that's not to say that we shouldn't probe to see if at some point we get there, right? So we're not there yet, but let's see how the AI tool develops to allow for the most efficient use. And again, the comparative jurisdictional analysis is absolutely necessary. We cannot fall behind in our attempt to modernize Canadian federal procurement.
Thank you. On the idea of a chief procurement officer, why should that ultimately accountable person not be the minister themselves or their DM?
So the realities are the minister is pulled in several directions all the time. So absolutely, they should have ultimate responsibility. But what we have seen in the past in mandate letters, that there has been transparency around the need to hold poor performing vendors accountable, and it's included in the minister's mandate letter. And yet we still don't have accountability because ultimately it wasn't done, right? And so we're now at the project pilot stage within a singular department. And like I said, we are optimistically tracking this pilot in hopes that it continues to solidify, show good results, and grow. Because it's also premature to say you can just roll out a government-wide system without having trialed it. So we're not suggesting that. But what we're trying to do is encourage additional pressure and transparency around what is happening in the environment to ensure that these changes actually have accountability. And that's what the role of the CPO would do. It's singularly focused on this exclusive issue.
Hi, Jillian Piper with Global News. The Auditor General recently found the government wasn't following procurement rules around securing contracts, for example. Should there be bigger repercussions or penalties put in place when the government doesn't follow its own procurement rules?
So we are a recourse mechanism that looks at what recourses exist. So there's ourselves, the Canadian International Trade Tribunal, and the court system that ultimately determine what the repercussions are to the federal departments. If it takes on a criminal nature, then it would be referred to the RCMP. So that's the framework of rules that exist. But again, I think your question speaks to accountability. What types of accountability exist within the federal government to ensure the rules are followed? And I think it is important for people to stand up and say, I've made a mistake. If that mistake is not of criminal nature, then ultimately the framework that exists, I do believe, is sufficient. But one of the struggles we're having is that people are not holding themselves accountable. Again, I work a lot with people on the buy side. They are trying hard to implement the rules. So I think it's a little bit unfair to them to just say they're simply not following the rules. There may be, discrete bad apples, but I would say that there is a significant effort to follow the rules. And that's why the third foundational change is we have to change the framework of rules because there are so many. And the complexity of that web is not such that every person within the procurement system understands how they interact. So to simply say the rules were not followed and should have been is a little bit unfair to the procurement community because they are trying. And again, I'm not discounting the fact that we have some bad actors. Absolutely we do. And part of our oversight responsibility is to root out those bad actors and ensure accountability.
Thank you. And just for my follow-up, you mentioned that there needs to be a culture shift in the government due to the sort of static nature of all of these problems that you've highlighted. Why, in your view, I think you mentioned this in French, has the government not acted over the years so far? And what is the biggest barrier, I guess, to actually getting government on board?
So in my role, having the insight of being able to see the reviews that our office has done since inception, so 2008, I think my frustration has bubbled to the point where I know that something needs to be done. Everyone's on a different journey, right? And so sometimes you have new people who come on board, and they're briefed on the issue, right? So they need time to come to grips with what's been happening in the past, right? And I think that's the advantage I have, having been in this role for 7.5 years. I know what the frustrations are. They are real, right? And they exist. And so that accountability that you want to attribute to a singular person, that person has evolved over time and they change departments. And so that level of accountability doesn't necessarily remain with the same minister, the same deputy. And so you need to have that oversight of responsibility and accountability. And again, that goes back to this notion of the chief procurement officer. That person must be held accountable and they have to take accountability for the implementation of this change. Otherwise, all of the other factors lead us to be here 5 years from now talking about these same issues. So there needs to be an acknowledgement, and I don't bring up that specific example about the Canadian supplier selling to other jurisdictions because it's easier. Because if you unpackage that, right, it's a very damning statement because we should be growing our Canadian suppliers by selling to the Canadian federal government. They gain the experiences and then they're able to get foreign government contracts because they've grown to a certain size, not pursuing federal government contracts in other jurisdictions because they can't or don't want to sell to the Canadian federal government.
In terms of this overhaul of the system that you are presenting today, what do you think is a reasonable timeline to implement these changes? And of the 5, which ones do you think the federal government is willing to say, okay, we can do this now?
So a realistic time frame differs per issue, right? I would say the CPO is immediate. The creation of the CPO is seminal to the implementation of all other aspects. The next one that I would highlight is also the fact that we've seen a recent amalgamation of the delegation of authorities. So that has changed recently. So there was an order in council that was made effective approximately a month ago, which changed how the delegations work. So there's definitely more power within the minister at PSPC than there was earlier on in this year, right? Which makes me believe that the power of the CPO could be even more significant. Because when I talked about this bifurcated system where there's multiple actors playing multiple roles that requires cohesion, there was a cohesion created by that change. The CPO could leverage that cohesion by making certain things mandatory at a horizontal level that weren't possible before. So that's an important change, and that's a change that's already taken place. And I would say that we are seeing incremental changes in all aspects that we were talking about. I'm not suggesting the federal government is doing nothing. What I'm suggesting is we cannot just simply take baby steps and then 3 years from now assess how far we've gotten. Again, it's a critical moment in time, so it's expedite all of these as quickly as possible. So do I think it's realistic? Absolutely. Do I think changing the rules is going to happen overnight? Absolutely not. This is something that will require significant thought to ensure that you don't create new loopholes, right? So we need to understand when we create a new rule, like what all of the permutations and combinations are of that rule to ensure that we're not here talking about a new scandal because a new subset of factors, played into a new loophole that was created. So to directly answer your question, each one has a different time frame. I think CPO is immediate. VPM, we're on a track to get there, but we need accountability to ensure it goes government-wide. The rules is a medium term. I think we have to look at other jurisdictions. I think other jurisdictions are looking at their own processes now and saying, are we the most efficient and effective as we could be? AI, again, having a minister with the focus of AI is a good first step. Don't lose sight of procurement and the data collection. Again, everyone in the room has to agree that data collection on procurement-related issues has been a sticking point. We need a concerted effort. I see that as a short-term fix with a longer-term reach.
For my follow-up, you seem to, you were talking about how Canadian suppliers went to other governments in order to get contracts as opposed to working within our own Canadian government. Does the system that you see, is it based on favoring, giving preferential treatment to Canadian suppliers? And if that's the case, how do we ensure that taxpayers are still getting value? Because of scale, other international suppliers may be able to offer services at lower rates.
Right. So we still have free trade obligations that govern procurement at higher dollar thresholds in many services and commodities. And so when you talk about Canadian favoritism, it doesn't apply in that universe, right? So there's only certain circumstances where we can truly favor Canadian suppliers, right? In terms of ensuring value, one of the ways that you can ensure value is ensuring competition. Right? And what we're seeing as an office is a stunning lack of competition in competitive processes, right? So ensuring we have a robust and diverse supply chain in Canada is all of our responsibilities, but ensuring that they can grow by selling to the federal government is also part of that solution. So again, I don't think the issue right now in our laps is how much money would we lose as a result of favoring Canadian companies when we can. The answer is how do we get as many Canadian companies selling to the federal government to ensure that competitive tension and that we do get the best price.
Hi. So I understand your work focuses more on improving process and practices, but what's there to be said about the lack of consequences when it comes to procurement misconduct? As in, why don't we see more companies getting banned or contracts getting suspended or any other legal action unless something becomes really political? And I'm wondering, like, if you have any specific recommendations, beyond what's in the report already.
Yeah, so absolutely. It actually speaks to the fifth issue, which is data, right? So I know reporters asked questions about, fraud in consulting. How many times were specific suppliers involved with overbilling? And it took, weeks and months of research trying to identify where there may have been overlaps in billing processes, right? So by having accurate data, that would actually start to address the issue. Now, it's not the consequences part of the question that you've asked, but that's identifying the issue so that it can be remedied immediately. Because I don't think we don't want to create scandal and address our issues by way of scandal. We want to be proactive and we want to ensure that we're catching these issues in real time. And so if we have a more robust data framework, then all of a sudden a red flag would go up immediately. And also we've seen a shift away from task-based into solutions-based when it comes to services, right? And that shift kind of takes away some of the issues that we are seeing in terms of how some suppliers were billing. And I do think the media has done a great job in creating a chill effect, right? Because now people are paying attention. I'm not sure that the supplier community ever thought that they would be held accountable for some of their poor practices. So part of my responsibility is to focus on the practices of government buyers. My responsibilities do not extend to the suppliers, right? So I do think the media's attention on some of this has actually brought accountability to suppliers to know that it's not without recourse, that there could be recourse. And I agree that if we're noting these same issues in 6 months, 1 year from now, the repercussions should be more significant than they are today.
Also, in a previous report, you flagged concerns about favoritism towards suppliers, such as McKinsey. You found departments changing procurement rules to cater to other certain suppliers. Do you think appointing a CPO could prevent such treatment in the future?
So I think what I anticipate the CPO being empowered to do is having horizontal consistency, right? So currently, I think each department does things slightly differently. So when we see horizontal issues, I see those as directly in the responsibility for the CPO. How individual departments implement those horizontal interpretations, there still has to be some accountability within departments. However, if the favoritism starts to look like it's horizontal, then absolutely that becomes the responsibility of the Chief Procurement Officer, because something systemic has happened. And equally so, it falls in my respective mandate, because systemic reviews can look at multiple departments and bad practices. So that is directly within our responsibility as well. Thank you.
In major projects, and procurements are major projects in many cases, we often say that you can either do it, you have to choose two, fast, well, or cheap. What you propose today, what do you think of those three are the most important? The two that you think are the most critical to address right now, and what you're proposing today, what do they address really in a priority way?
So it's a fair question, and I can certainly say the government currently has a huge priority on fast, right? And our priority is open, fair, and transparent. And so we know that there's a way to incorporate fast into open, fair, and transparent, but it's, again, you have to be transparent about the speed, right? And then you have to follow through. So unfortunately, what the government has been known to do is create these very aggressive timelines in solicitation processes that ultimately aren't met. Right? And then there's subsequent obligations that then are also implicated by not meeting those initial timeframes. So then you start to lose the faith of the industry. So what I think the most important is to retain an open, fair, and transparent system that understands the timeliness that's critical. So again, it's not magic, right? It's not, you can't fix the system overnight. But I think understanding that time is one of the key priorities of the current government, that needs to be looked at through the existing lens, and we have to be realistic and transparent with exactly what we're doing. So if we're taking shortcuts, be transparent about those shortcuts, understand the implications of those shortcuts, and accept the risk. And that's absolutely fine, but then also wear that risk if it materializes.
You talk about fast and how you see this being a problem, but when we think about military procurement, and you said you talked with Mr. Fuhr, fast is not the word that comes to mind to many Canadians when they look at those procurement. What you're mentioning about those short deadlines and how the people in this ecosystem are seeing them, are you seeing that problem also on the military side, or is the fast aspect not present there or differently?
No, so I would suggest fast is also a priority on the military side. And I think you wouldn't be shocked to learn that there's a significant amount of pressure given recent government announcements around spending, right? And so clearly fast is going to be a priority. So how do you overlay open, fair, and transparent in fast, right? And again, I think there's a lot of really smart, creative people thinking that through. And the only thing we would ask as an office is make sure whatever you're doing is communicated transparently to everyone. So you can decide, do you want to participate in the process as explained or not? And if you have an issue, raise it to our office, raise it to the attention of oversight bodies, and we can look into it and say, is this an appropriate decision? And at some point, the answer might be yes, and at some point the answer might be no. Thanks.
On the issue of fast, the Prime Minister has obviously talked about this, and you kind of alluded to it a moment ago. How well equipped is the current bureaucracy, machinery of government, whatever you want to call it, to implement this build, baby, build in the time of crisis that the Prime Minister keeps talking about? And what you've kind of touched on what the risks might be in terms of transparency, but what else can you say about how what you're saying aligns with the current political climate that we're all in?
Yeah, so absolutely, I think, as I mentioned in the previous answer, fast is clearly a priority. And I think my comment about creativity is there's multiple different avenues in how to create fast. It doesn't all have to flow through traditional procurement methodologies. There could also be transfers to provinces and municipalities who would already be responsible for implementation of those projects. If they remain federal projects, then those could be done by way of a traditional procurement process. And in that same vein, we are also working as an office to create solutions. And so, not to bore you with some kind of procurement basics, but our federal system is predicated on this antiquated contract A-B dynamic, which doesn't necessarily breed to the most advantageous outcomes in many circumstances. And so we've done a lot of research on negotiated RFPs. So if you go to our website, you will see that we've done a paper on the use of negotiated RFPs at the federal level and what that might mean. So it allows for more direct negotiations. It doesn't necessarily address the speed component, but it does address the constantly changing environment, which is another issue that we've highlighted in these large infrastructure spends, is that there is an evolution over time. And if the procurement process is static and doesn't allow for that evolution to happen in real time, by the time that you acquire the good or service or construction project, there are already components of it that are obsolete. So that negotiation component that remains vibrant throughout the procurement process is absolutely essential to ensuring that you can take into consideration the changing conditions. And I think that is part of the frustration, and you see that clearly on the defense side, where by the time the acquisition is actually taken, the equipment or the solution is already either partially or fully obsolete.
My follow-up, I guess, is on defense. Then Canada's committing to join the Rearm Europe initiative. How important is it for Canada to do better militarily on procurement, and what are you seeing in other jurisdictions, like say European jurisdictions, on how maybe they're doing it better or worse, and what's in store for Canada on that front?
Yeah, and you have to be a bit careful with what you read as well, right? So our report does do a cross-jurisdictional analysis as to what other jurisdictions are doing. And I would certainly say that sometimes people have a more advantageous spin on changes that they've made. But looking at the UK example closely, they actually implemented many of the changes that we're talking about in terms of creation of the CPO as an agent for change, looking at their rules governance, making sure they have a robust vendor performance management. So again, these aren't these wild ideas that no other jurisdiction has done. And looking at the UK, I think, is a really good model to look at. Now, depending on where you glean your information, you might see people expressing really supportive commentary around how significant the changes are and the benefits that the UK has accrued as a result. You can also read similarly criticisms of those processes that haven't really made significant inroads. And I think the truth, as always, is somewhere near the middle. That being said, we know that our system is more archaic than that of many of our allies. And so looking at other European models, and there are model rules put out by the European Union that we could look to, not necessarily for adoption, but just to see how they've addressed similar issues. And I think you can talk to some European suppliers and ask them for their impressions of Canadian federal government procurement compared to the European model. And if you get some frank answers, I think you'll have some interesting quotes.
Morning. So I thought I would ask you about the, obviously in recent months, there's been a lot of problems with Indigenous procurement and abuse of the system by individuals and companies. And just wondering if you had any thoughts, what might improve that system?
So you will notice in our report that there is a section around Indigenous procurement, and in the end we highlight that we actually are in the midst of doing a systemic review on Indigenous procurement. At this point, we're still doing our file and documentation review, so it would be a little premature for me to say, but I can simply say that we will have a lot to say on this subject kind of in the near term, because there are issues that are reflected, both what we heard in the previous Parliament and I think what we're seeing as part of the preliminary review in our report. So please do follow that closely. We anticipate obviously reporting to parliamentary committees at the time of completion.
Yeah, I do have a follow-up, and not sure if you can answer it or not, but I thought I would try as well. There's been actual sort of vetting or proof of Indigenous identity can be a complex thing, and whether there's several. The Indigenous Business Council has its own sort of list of companies that it believes are Indigenous, and but has not been used by the federal government, as far as I know. Do you believe when in doing so, it's kind of new ground, I guess, in terms of procurement for the government? Should this be something that's done in-house in the government, or do you think it should be sort of shopped out to Indigenous organization to do and to verify?
Yeah, so as much as I love to answer questions directly, that's more of a policy question, but I will say we must always lead with respect when dealing with Indigenous suppliers. And so if respect is the central kind of mandate, then I think decisions from that respect should follow. So I'm not answering your question, but I'm trying to hint at what I think is an appropriate solution.
Hi, good morning. You said in the absence of the VPN system that departments are, trying to take this patchwork approach in rooting out poor performers, but this can essentially have inadvertent consequences by rooting out other viable ones. Is there an example where you think that's happened, where competition has been affected?
So competition is an issue that we're studying closely. I wouldn't want to hypothesize as to what might happen as a result of rooting out the bad apples, but I would kind of defer back to the data component. So if we had more real-time data tracking, there shouldn't be any impacts to good performing suppliers. If the changes made to the rules ultimately have that impact, and we might be seeing some of that, but again, like I said, it's premature. These changes are very new, and we will be looking at them in some of our follow-up reviews. So again, I hope that many of you consult our website regularly. We are constantly posting new materials, whether it be reviews or research papers that I think will further inform the important work that you do in bringing transparency to procurement. So all that to say, absolutely there could be some ramifications, but it's too soon to say.
And just as a follow-up, what kind of response or reception have you gotten from either of the two ministers or the department on your recommendation to bring in the VPN system? And I'm jumping the gun, but are there any counter arguments that they're presenting to you?
Yeah, so the reception is always positive, and I will say that it has been for some time, right? And it's logic. So that's why I bring up the plumber example as often as I do, because again, logic dictates that this must be happening. It happens in many other jurisdictions successfully, and it's just a missing puzzle piece in the federal system that has negative repercussions for not having that puzzle piece. So I think everyone acknowledges its importance, and I do think specifically with the department, they have seized this. So I don't want to suggest that they're not making improvements and constantly trying to get the pilot implementation to the point where they can roll this out formally. So kudos on that side, but what I have to be honest about is I've been in this role for 7 years. I've been talking about VPM for 7 years. And so absolutely the department is seized with this issue, as are the ministers, but it well predates them. And like I answered in the previous question, new people are stepping into these issues each time, and it takes a little bit of time for them to grow acclimatized to why this hasn't happened. And then when they realize it hasn't happened, there are going to be barriers to implementation. So let's not kid ourselves. None of this is going to be easy, but foundational change is necessary. So you have to get over those hurdles in order to get to that outcome that we seek. So if we're always looking at that first hurdle and saying it's insurmountable, then we're never going to get to where we need to go.
Thank you. That concludes today's press conference. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.